much. Thank you, everybody, and welcome again to the House of the Seven Gables. I'm going to start by reading a little quote from our esteemed author of the evening. I used to write at the Gables, in the garden, under the arbor. Dusty the cat used to visit me there. It was an amazing place to write. I think the place inspired the book to begin with. Sitting in that wonderful garden, in that inspiring and historic setting, the story just came. The muse was sitting right there with me. Well, we're happy to have Brunonia Barry standing right here with us tonight. These are her words, the author of the New York Times bestselling novel, The Lace Reader, and the focus of tonight's closing event for the Salem Literary Festival, which is the Map of True Places. Brunonia is a Salem native, although she spent some time on the West Coast, so she definitely has a great perspective for us. She's a literary scholar, she's a lover of Hawthorne and Melville's works, and speaks to those occasionally as well. And she's someone who's truly found her place as an author, and we're very happy to have her here tonight. She's prepared a delightful program for us this evening, where we're going to all be invited to explore our own true places. So not only are we going to get a talk on the Map of True Places, but we'll get a chance to do a little bit of writing on our own, which is a really special treat for a lecture. It's not just talking, it's a little interaction as well. And for those of us who can't get enough of writing or for the Map of True Places, we do invite you again to our museum store for afterwards. If you have any special questions for Brunonia, she'll be over there for Q&A, and she'll also be over there signing copies of the book as well. So we'll invite you over there afterwards. But without further ado, I introduce Brunonia Barry, and thank you. I'll also be her scribe for the evening when I assign.
She has good penmanship. I do not. Can you hear me? Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Kara, and thank you to the House of Seven Gables, because I'm not sure without this place this book would exist. When they asked me to do the seventh lecture of the 7 lectures at the Gables, I was asked to do something about the Map of True Places and to talk a bit about how about process and how it came to be in the first place. Which I'm going to do. I'm going to do some readings from the book. But one of the things we were asked to think about was, what are your true places? And I am taking the focus, that kind of focus for this. This isn't a book sale lecture. This is about true places in your hearts. And don't get worried about me turning you into writers. We have quite a few writers here, and I won't make you share anything you don't want to share. But we'll do about a 15-minute writer's prompt at the end, which should be a lot of fun. I do have to welcome my friends from Writer Unboxed here, who've come from all over. They're sitting in that row there. And I will be calling on you all during that exercise. Well, when I started, the second book that I wrote is The Map of True Places, and when I started it, my publisher said, we want another book from you in 2 years. This is after at least a 6-month book tour. Don't leave Salem, but write something completely different. And I had planned to write a sequel to The Lace Reader, so that was not good news necessarily. But because history casts a long shadow and we really live in it, in this city, I thought, get out and walk around a bit, and I'm sure a story will come. So the first thing I did was just walk down by the wharf here, down by the Friendship, and I got myself a cup of coffee, and which I was still drinking at the time. I'm off of caffeine now, and sat on the bench and watched one of the riggers on the Friendship, 100 feet in the air at least, without a harness, swinging back and forth, and a voice came to me that said, he moves like a dancer or a spider. And I thought, okay. I promptly gave up caffeine because I was so nervous watching, I don't know what the OSHA rules were, but we weren't obeying them that day, I don't think. Anyway, that was the first character I met from The Lace Reader. And his name was Hawk. Now, this is not a real character. This is what your imagination does as you're drinking your 3rd cup of coffee and you're sitting trying to come up with a story. But what I thought about Hawk was, this may be my main character. And since I didn't quite know how to approach that and didn't have enough information yet, I kept walking. And I walked down to Turner Street and to the House of the Seven Gables. And as I was here, I met another character whose name was Finch. And he was, now, in my mind, really, I'm not hallucinating, but this is imagination. He was living in a house across the street from the house of Seven Gables. And he was selling everything that his lover owned through the window, recreating Hepzibah's scent shop. And with a sign that said, "Everything must go." And I thought, well, there's a little conflict there. There's been a bad breakup. This is his life partner, whose name happened to be Melville. So this all just came to me as I'm, fully caffeinated and still walking. About that time, I was looking at both of these characters and saying, is this my protagonist? Is this my protagonist? And I had no idea really which one was when someone else drove up. And her name was Z. And when she pulled up to the house, it was her father who was selling all the belongings through the window. And she was shocked because her father wasn't well. Her father had Parkinson's with Alzheimer's crossover, and this was the first she had ever heard about this. So this is all a product of my imagination, mind you. At some point I started talking to my friends at the House of Seven Gables, and they said, would you like to write the book here? Yeah, sure, I would love to. And I started writing in the gardens at the House of Seven Gables, which really was inspirational. If you think you're being visited by the muse, come here. There's quite a lot of visitation going on. The funny thing about being asked to write at the House of Seven Gables was that I had been a tour guide here for 2 weeks when I was in high school. I was a substitute tour guide after someone went back to college. And I studied up, I read everything, and I led the tours into the secret room. And I was very proud of myself until coming down the back stairs one day, I met someone who said, Miss Barry, come over here. You should go home now. And I was fired. And what I was fired for was making up stories. So I credit the House of Seven Gables with my whole literary career. So they didn't know that when they asked me to come right here. In fact, when I told them, someone said, oh, were you the one who fell asleep on the bed? That wasn't me.
I know who that was.
It wasn't me. I'm going to do a few readings from the book, but I want to tell you something about the characters. My main character, Z. Finch, is a psychologist who is engaged to marry one of Boston's most eligible bachelors. But she can't seem to make any kinds of decisions about what the wedding should be like, and it's driving them both crazy. In fact, she can't seem to make much of a decision about anything at all. And this is compounded greatly when a patient commits suicide, and it really sends her over the edge. And it's in a manner that mirrors her mother's suicide when she was younger. So this just takes her back, and she's, it's a mirror to who she is, and she falls apart. And when she comes back to visit her father after the funeral she should never have attended in the first place of her patient, she sees him in a terrible state and realizes that they've been keeping secrets from her, he and his partner, and she had no idea how bad he was, and she decides to ditch her life and come back to Salem to take care of her dad. Now, they say life imitates art and art imitates life, but, or write what you know, and we had recently moved back to Massachusetts, my husband and I, because my dad had Parkinson's with Alzheimer's crossover. So this was a very personal story, and in fact, I first thought I would write the character of Finch, but he was a little too much for me to have him be my protagonist, to tell you the truth, because we were in the middle of caregiving. My brother, who's in the first row, can attest to this, as can my husband. So I focused on Z and what she was feeling, and I spent the whole book really trying to answer a question of what it was she wanted. You always ask that of your protagonist and all of your characters, I think, and what was keeping her from getting it. I'm going to read you just a little bit of the prologue and an introduction to Z. In the years when her middle name was Trouble, Z had a habit of stealing boats. Her father never suspected her of any wrongdoing. He let her run free in those early days after her mother's death. He was busy being a pirate reenactor, an odd leap for a man who'd been a literary scholar all his life. But those were desperate times, and they were both weary from constantly carrying their loss, unable to put it down, except in those brief moments when they could throw themselves into something beyond the reach of their memories. In her fantasy world, the one where she could forgive herself for what happened that year, Z liked to think that her father, Finch, would have been proud of her skills as a thief. In her wildest dreams, she pictured him joining her adventure, a huge leap for the professor, but not for the pirate he was quickly becoming. She had a preference for speedboats. Anything that could do over 30 knots was fair game. There was little security back then, and most of the keys, if there were any, were hidden somewhere on the boats themselves, usually in the most obvious place imaginable. The game was simple. She would pick a boat that looked fast and sleek, give herself exactly 5 minutes to break in and get the engine started, and head out of the harbor toward the ocean. Once she passed the confines of Salem, she would open up the engine and point the bow straight out at Baker's Island. Later that night, she would return the stolen boat. There was only one rule. She could never return a boat to the same mooring from which she'd stolen it. It was a good rule, not just because it presented an additional challenge, but also because it was practical. If she put the boat back on the same mooring, she would be much more likely to get caught. Everyone knows that the last thing any good thief should do is revisit the scene of the crime. Usually, Z would abandon the boat at one of the public wharfs that line Salem's waterfront. Often it was the one at the Willows, the first wharf you came to when you entered the harbor. But when the cops started looking for her, she began to leave the boats in other, less obvious places. Sometimes she would jump someone else's mooring, or she would leave a boat in one of the slips at Derby Wharf, which made it easy to get away since she lived so close. Only one time did she mess up and misjudge the fuel level. She was all the way up by Singing Beach in Manchester when the engine died. At first, she didn't believe she'd run out of gas, but when she checked the fuel again, her mistake was clear. Fighting the panic that was beginning to overtake her, she tried to come up with a plan. She could easily swim to shore, but if she did, the boat would either drift out to sea and smash against the rocks, or smash against the rocks. For the first time, she was afraid of getting caught. In a strange way, she was grateful that there were no other boats around, no one she could signal for help. Not knowing what else to do, she let the boat drift. She looked up at the moonless sky, the stars brighter than she'd ever seen them, their reflections dissolving in the water around her, like an effervescent medicine that seemed to dissolve her panic as well. Here, floating along with the current, staring up at the heavens, she knew that everything would be all right. When she looked back down at the horizon to get her bearings, she found that she had drifted toward shore. A dark outline of something appeared in her peripheral vision, and when she turned to face it, a wharf came into focus, and on the hill beyond it, a darkened house. She grabbed an oar and began to steer the boat in toward shore, catching the on-sweep of tide that propelled it broadside toward the wharf. She grabbed the bow line and jumped, slipping and twisting her ankle a little, but keeping the boat from colliding with the wharf. She tied up, securing bow and stern, and scrambled over the rocks to the beach. Then she made her way up the road toward the train station, limping a bit from her aching ankle, but not too bad, all things considered. Z wanted to take the train back to Salem, but it was past midnight, and the trains had stopped running. She thought about sleeping on the beach. It was a warm night, it would have been safe. But she didn't want to concern her father, who had enough to worry about these days, and she didn't want to be anywhere in the vicinity of Manchester when they found the stolen boat. So she ended up hitchhiking back to Salem. Not a smart thing to do, she thought, as she walked to the Chevy Nova that had stopped about 50 feet ahead of her and was frantically backing up. It was a woman who picked her up, probably mid-40s, slightly overweight, with long hair and blue eyes that glowed with the light of passing cars. At first, the woman said she was only going as far as Beverly, but then she changed her mind and decided to take Z all the way home, because if she didn't, she was afraid that Z would start hitching again and might be picked up by a murderer or a rapist. As they rode down Route 127, the woman told Z every horror story she ever heard about hitchhiking, and then made Z give her word never to do it again, and Z promised just to shut her up. That's what all the kids say, but they do it anyway, the woman said. Z wanted to tell her that she never hitched, that she wasn't the victim type, and that she had only thumbed a ride tonight to cover a crime she committed, grand theft bodo. But she didn't know what other cautionary tales such a confession might unleash, so she kept her mouth shut. As she was getting out of the car, Z turned back to the woman. Instead of saying thank you, she said, in a voice straight out of a Saturday morning cartoon, "Will you be my mommy?" She'd meant it as a joke, but the woman broke down. She just started crying and wouldn't stop. Z told the woman that she was kidding. She had her own mother, she said, even though it wasn't true, not anymore. Nothing she said would stop the woman's tears, and so finally she said what she should have said all along: "Thank you for the ride." Of course, Z hadn't given the woman her real address. She didn't want her getting any ideas, like maybe going to the house and having a word with Finch. She planned to hide in the shadows until the woman drove away, and then cut through the neighboring yards to get home. But in the end, she just walked straight down the road. The woman was crying too hard to notice where Z went or how she got there. 10 years later, as Z was training to become a psychotherapist, having outgrown the middle name Trouble, she saw the woman again in one of the panic groups run by her mentor, Dr. Liz Mattei. The woman didn't remember her, but Z would have known her anywhere. Those same translucent blue eyes, still teary. The woman had lost a child, a teenager and a runaway, she said. Her daughter had been diagnosed as bipolar, like Z's mother, Maureen, but had refused to keep taking lithium because it made her fat. She'd been last seen hitchhiking on Route 95, heading south, holding a hand-lettered sign that read, New York. It was the winter of 2001, and 10 years since the woman had lost her daughter. The Twin Towers had recently come down. The panic group had grown in size, but its original members had become oddly more calm and helpful to each other, as if their free-floating anxiety had finally taken form, and the rest of the country had begun to feel the kind of terror they'd felt every day for years. For the first time Z could remember, people in the group actually looked at each other, and when the woman talked about her daughter, as she had every week they'd been meeting, the group finally heard her. "The world can change just like that," the woman said. In the blink of an eye, someone answered. Tissues were passed, and the group cried together for the first time, for the girl, and for her inevitable loss of innocence, and of course, for their own. So that's my main character, Z. And it always comes down to a question whenever you're writing a book, at least it does for me. And the question usually starts with what if? What if the maps we've relied on to chart our life's course no longer work? We've heard the phrase or the quote, "The only constant is change." I think we can attest to that, and the events of this last week have shown us more of that. But for me, writing is all about questions, and then learning to live in the question, because I actually think when you answer a question in your book, it's more propaganda than writing. Other writers may have something to say about that, but you listen to your characters, I think, you don't manipulate them. And so the whole puzzle of this book was finding out what Z wanted and how to get her there. But we still find ourselves inside the story. We have to have some connection to what we're writing, or we couldn't write it. So I told you I had moved back when my father was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And then everything had changed. And in the time since I'd written my first book and my second, both of my parents had died. 9/11 had happened. Even the people at the publishing house that I was with were shifting. Almost no one was at the same place they were a couple of years ago. And the question was all around me about the maps. Even my writing space is a map room. It's interesting. We bought the house from some artists, and they had covered the walls of their son's room with old National Geographics. And so that's my writing room now. But you notice that even in those, especially in those, a lot of the countries aren't even there anymore. They have different names. And so this was all pointing to something about doing something with maps, but I didn't even see it. You know, I was head down writing, and I really couldn't figure it out for the longest time. But what I kept wondering during this whole period was, what can you rely on when your course has changed, the course you've charted has changed? What is true and what is real and what is constant? And eventually I looked up. I was outside one night and I looked up and I thought, it's the stars. It's not that stars don't move, but our perception of their movement is not there. It may seem like they're moving in the heavens, but of course it's we who are moving. So I had developed in doing some research about Salem an interest in celestial navigation. And what I decided on that particular day, when I decided that stars are our constant, or at least as an image system for the book, and I always need an image system. The first one was lace, this last one is trees, and the middle book that we're talking about tonight is stars. I thought, well, first of all, trying to learn celestial navigation was another challenge in itself, but I thought, well, there has to be a character who's involved in this, and that's when I went back to Hawke, who was the character on the rigging of the Friendship. So I'm going to read you a little bit about him now, and about celestial navigation. So Hawke is a very handsome man. And when I wrote this, I said he looked like George Clooney, and we can update that or whatever, just let your fantasies take over. But he has, one of the requirements of his job is that he teaches celestial navigation to people who want to go out. It can't be in the Friendship in this year because the Friendship wasn't sailing with the public on it. But he would take people out in a Sim Davis lobster boat and teach them celestial navigation. Well, it turned out, because he was so handsome, that most of his classes were made up of women. And he gets kidded about this a lot. They're known as the Yacht Club Cougars. So, Hawke arranged to take the class out in his boat, a 1941 Sim Davis lobster boat, a 40-footer with a winch and gear removed, which Hawke had spent the last summer restoring and was now living on, just a few slips down from the Friendship. In Hawke's opinion, there are 2 times a day when it is best to take sights, dawn and dusk. Twilight sights are taken just before the horizon disappears into either darkness or light, in those few minutes when the planets and locator stars are still visible. It's a moment in time and it takes practice. For the beginner especially, it would be important to get to a spot where Hawke knew that the stars would be visible along the horizon, which meant they had to get away from shore. They left an hour before sunset in order to make it to open ocean. It was a relatively calm evening, and his boat was sturdy, so they wouldn't have to deal with much chop. This was both good and bad. The sextant was a durable instrument meant to take vertical angles from a moving ship. One of the reasons for going out was that the students would get used to the movement of the boat and accustomed to taking readings in any conditions. The women arrived early with picnic gear and bottles of wine. "I hope you also brought your notebooks and sextants," he said when he saw the bottles sticking out of their LL Bean campus bags. They headed out, passing the tiny lighthouse on Winter Island, and then Salem Willows Park, with its long wharf lined with men fishing for stripers. When Hawke passed the confines of Salem Harbor, he gunned the engine, heading between the Miseries and Children's Island, and as straight out to sea as was possible in the sheltered waters that ran between Salem and Cape Ann. "Where are we going?" one of the cougars finally asked. "We have to get past land by twilight," he said. They sat quietly in the stern. He finally stopped the boat at a spot he knew well, where the chop wasn't too bad. Behind them, fading into the distance, was the entire North Shore, and to the south, the vague outline of the Boston skyline. But straight ahead, if you didn't look back, was a clear horizon. "It's a bit rough out here," one of the students said. "Not at all," Hawke replied. "What if in the middle of a shipping lane?" another asked. "We're not," he said. One of the women had pulled out a bottle of wine and was looking for a corkscrew. "I didn't know this was a party," Hawke said. "I generally like to have a little wine before I rock my sextant," the woman said. The other women giggled, and Hawk hoped he wasn't blushing. "You ladies are relentless." "We prefer to think of ourselves as focused," one of them said. They got out their notebooks and their plastic sextants, things Hawk hated but had to admit were adequate for class. He kept one of them himself as a backup, though if he had to, he could get a reading without a sextant at all. Watches were another matter. In order to get an accurate reading, you had to track Greenwich Mean Time to the second. If you spent enough time on the water, you planned for all possible worst-case scenarios. He knew at least 3 sailors who had horror stories about failed GPS devices. Some were ocean legend, but he knew that at least a few of them were true. Tonight, the ladies were all wearing quartz wristwatches, something you didn't see much in these days of cell phones. Hawk turned on the shortwave and tuned to WWV to sync with Greenwich Mean Time. He listened to the tick and the tones until the time was announced, and he looked on as the women checked their watches. So far, they seemed to know what they were doing. A good sign, he thought. Only one of the women hadn't brought a watch, and he quietly handed her his. He had at least 2 more of them in the cabin, more worst-case scenario planning. It was possible to figure Greenwich Mean Time by taking moon sights, but it was difficult and not nearly as accurate, and he didn't like to do it except in an extreme emergency. He wasn't going to even bring up moon sights tonight. He didn't want to confuse them. Let them master the sextant first. Hawk checked the sunset. In the distance, the landscape of Boston glimmered red and purple. Quickly, he turned away from the image and saw, and in the opposite direction, toward the horizon line. The sun had set about 10 minutes ago. It was twilight. "Check your watches," he said. "It's time." Everyone stopped talking. "Tonight, we're looking to fix our position on at least 2 of the 3 stars you've chosen. With any luck, we'll be able to see all 3. They should be low on the horizon. This won't be like the sights you took from the Friendship. There's a lot more motion out here. You want to rock the sextants back and forth, watching the arc, and keep adjusting until the star you sight is sitting directly on the horizon line." "Don't worry," he said. "These instruments are built for chop. It's actually easier to get a reading on a moving ship than from a fixed position." He walked back and forth, helping the women position their instruments. "Don't be fooled by the planets. We're looking for stars. Planets look more like disks. They don't twinkle." It took a while, but they all seemed to get it. When they began to take their readings, the group grew even quieter. The shyest of them gasped. Hawk leaned over and took a quick look at her sight and then smiled at her. "Nice, huh?" he said. "Beautiful." He'd done this thousands of times, but it never failed to fill him with awe. There was a moment when he spotted that first star, a pinpoint of light just where, if you'd done your calculations correctly, it was supposed to be in the sky. He'd heard it described as a religious experience. He wasn't sure about that. But when you spotted that first star, or when the stars crossed exactly where they were supposed to cross, there was nothing better. Even if you'd been dead reckoning in the middle of a storm, or if overnight the Gulf Stream had taken you 100 miles off course, if you'd done your calculations properly, there would be a moment when you found that the star you were looking for was exactly where it should be, on the horizon. In that instance, the universe made sense, and you knew that no matter what else happened in the world, the stars would always tell you where you were, and when they did, you would always be able to find your way home. So that brings me to True Place. And the question, well, actually that brings me to the title of the book, because I still didn't have a title. I was looking at every Hawthorne quote I could find, but with the exception of Unaccustomed Earth, which had just been used as a title, I wasn't finding anything that quotable as a title. I mean, there's a lot to quote in Hawthorne, but as titles of books go, I wasn't able to find anything. But since Finch's partner was named Melville, we started looking at Melville quotes too, and we had about 25 of them. And I still couldn't see what was right in front of me. And my husband, Gary, right there, one night circled one, and it was the Map of True Places. The quote was this, gave me the title of the Map of True Places. "It is now not down in any map, true places never are." And that's a quote from Melville. And so the book became the Map of True Places. And then, of course, the search for true place really began. So what is a true place? There's a Welsh word, and if I don't say this correctly, please correct me, but hiraeth, which is a homesickness for a home to which you cannot return, a home which maybe never was, the nostalgia, the yearning, the grief for the lost places of your past. It has a little bit of something to do with that, but it also has a future. And I think in this world of constant change, we need to be able to create those true places, which include, what is home, what is family, who are your people, where should you be, what should you be doing. That all is part of the question about true place. I had to imagine what a true place would look like for each character. Hawks, for example, was at sea under the stars. That was fairly obvious. Melville's was with Finch, the father. Finch's turned out to be in the pages of one of Hawthorne's books. And because he was a Hawthorne scholar, as his dementia progressed, he retreated into Hawthorne. In fact, he started to believe he was Hawthorne. The most difficult part, of course, was Z, my main character, as it should be. And there is a place that I envisioned, which was her mother Maureen's favorite place, Maureen who killed herself when Z was younger. And it was on Baker's Island. And for those of you who know Baker's, you probably will figure out why I picked that, but for those of you who don't, it doesn't change. Or, let's put it this way, they're trying to keep it from changing. It's a place that's been the same for, the same families have been going out there to summer for hundreds of years. And lately it's become a little controversial because other people are trying to visit it and they're trying to keep it a private island. So I picked that because I thought it was emblematic of what I was looking for, is a place that doesn't change. And of course every place changes. So this is the, to symbolize the place we hold in our hearts. So it becomes very important to Z, and I won't really explain how, but I do want to move on to the writer's prompt that I promised you now. Because what I wanted you to do was all think about what your true places are. And it doesn't matter whether you're writers or not. I'm going to read one more short reading and show you what I did to figure out what the cabin on Baker's Island would actually look like and what it was Z would be experiencing when she went out to the place her mother loved so much. So, what I'm going to ask you to do in just a bit, and I'll give you an example of this, is we're going to, not yet,
Okay.
but as soon as I read this, we're going to ask you for some suggestions of your true places. And it could be a simple object, it could be a feeling, use all your senses. And you just randomly name some things. I'm going to give you a list of what I was working on and then read you what came up for me. The only place, I'm sort of a method writer, which is a little bit like method acting, and you use what you have in your life to try to embody your characters. So you go to something from your own experience. So I came up with a list of things that were from our summer house in New Hampshire, a place that's been in the family for, 5 generations now. And I just started listing objects and thinking I could use this for the house on Baker's Island and to put myself in Z's character. So the first was the smell of my mother's taboo perfume. Camp coffee boiled over on the stove, a smashed eggshell, partially intact, partly broken. Oh, everything partly broken. A hand pump and a cracked soapstone sink, loose face powder, forgotten toothbrushes, photos frozen in time, a big green megaphone on a screen porch, Revlon's fire engine red lipstick, and a collapsed wooden garage. So those were the objects that I then tried to draw upon to do what we call a writer's prompt. And I tried to connect the objects in a way that would give me some insight into Z's character and what she would find on her island. This will be the last thing I read, and then we'll do our exercise. And most of these objects have made it into the book, strangely enough, even though they're personal to me. And this is about change, and this is my true place. They're all gone now, just their traces remain. Sense projections you can sometimes see, moving quickly from west to east. Spectral half images, a glint of eye, a strand of hair, the smell of my mother's taboo perfume, or my grandfather's puffy shaving cream. We always used to wash our hair in the lake. Children streaming suds across the water as we dove, such things still possible back then, for the ignorance of not knowing better. The fertile sweetness of the early morning camp coffee boiled over onto the stove, smashed egg and shell, still partially intact and fused to the burner spiral. Their traces exist in the things they left behind, all the extra or unmatched items they didn't want to be reminded of every day, but couldn't quite bear to part with. Still perfectly good, they said, or only partly broken. The visual reminders are everywhere. The hand pump in the cracked soapstone sink, unprimed now for so many years. The flue hole for the wood stove they took out after my brother got burned. The loose face powder from a great aunt in the washroom for a complexion even paler than my own. A half bottle of paregoric and another of iodine sitting on a high shelf in a medicine cabinet. Too many forgotten toothbrushes. A bridal portrait of my mother, aged 22, the one with its glass and frame broken long before I was born and replaced with saran wrap, back when saran wrap first came out. The photo makes the fix-it list every year, along with all the more crucial winter damage items that take priority. Each of their children had his own shelf. Uncle Morky, my mother June, and Uncle Whitney, all frozen in time. He was the baby of the family. There's a later photo of him winning a swimming plaque, and even later one of him in his pilot leathers just a year before his plane went down. I remember my grandfather's big green megaphone on the screen porch, the one they used to call us out of the lake when the storms were coming. Once I was small enough to hide under it, staring far-sighted at the top, at the blue porch ceiling, and spying on the conversations of the adults, trying to learn their secrets. The megaphone is gone now, replaced by a smaller brown one that not even the tiniest child could stand under. The stories they told linger in memory, embellished and edited, even then, as I embellish and edit the stories I pass down now. Like the one about my mother and her cousin Nancy trying on Revlon's fire engine red lipstick and kissing every mirror in the house. Traces of their kisses faintly lingering and reflecting back for generations, until finally this last summer they were gone. That's it. So that connected all the objects, and this is sort of a typical writing exercise. You come up with objects or thoughts, and then try to connect them in some meaningful way. And in this way, it was about true place. But of course, I didn't know what I was going to come up with. And what I learned from this, and you could tell me if you've learned something different, was if this is about Z, what is it that she really misses? I mean, the words broken and gone keep coming up. But I think you can see that even though I'm listing objects, this is people she's talking about that are broken or gone or have passed on. So that's what I found out about her. And of course, she lost her mother, so it made perfect sense. So tonight, I would ask you to all think about your true places in the world and the places you would want in your future. This isn't all past and it isn't all gone, but it is what you treasure. And I would like to ask you to go to the board.
Absolutely.
And just ask for some random thoughts that come. And I would say use your senses. If it's a smell of the ocean, say it. If it's a cracked coffee pot, say it. Whatever comes to you, but make it true to you. And then we'll do a little writer's exercise, and we'll turn you all into writers. And you don't have to share it, don't worry. But you can if you want. So, anybody? We've got the writers back here.
Picnic table.
Picnic table, very good.
Smell of low tide.
Mm.
Wood, brass, and leather.
Big glass cookie jar.
Oh.
With some toasted cookies. Full moon on snow.
The view from the top of Mount Chicoro.
We can spell Chicora.
Go ahead, spell.
Oh, I think it's fun for people to invent their own stuff.
No, C. Are you ready?
Warm raspberries.
What's that?
Warm raspberries.
Preach it.
For me, it's rocks with pictographs from thousands of years ago.
Oh,
Rocks with what?
Pictographs and petroglyphs.
and petroglyphs.
Okay. Sorry.
We probably have room for one more on the board.
The feeling of frayed rope.
Frayed rope. Ooh. Nice. Okay, I think that's good. Okay, now under your chairs, or maybe somewhere on your chairs, but there should be pencils, a piece of paper, and something to lean on. I think it was a folder.
Yes. And there are also some tables in the back if people
there are
want to
tables in the
put their
back.
chairs.
And I'm counting a lot of writers in here, so. Over to you, Jeff. So what we would do now, I would ask you, and this is a very typical writer's prompt, and just know that if you have a million images in your head that you want to write about, go ahead and do that. But I would ask you to pick 2 of these, and we'll spend 6 or 7 minutes connecting them in some way. And write anything that you come up with. You don't have to read it aloud, you don't have to do anything like that, but it should free up your idea of your true place. So if you have better imagery than this, go ahead and use it, but a good exercise, I think, is to pick one and have it be the beginning of your paragraph, and one and have it be the end. Okay. I urge you to continue this at home, but would anyone like to share with it? Go ahead. Anybody?
I didn't get to the picnic table, but I got to the Formula One scene. We have fallen off the map, not a GPS. This is way before the nice lady on my phone that tells me where to go. I'm curled up beneath 3 lap blankets in our old Subaru. Neil is at the wheel. The dog, Max, our white Lhasa Apso, snores on my feet, and they are the only part of me that's warm enough. South Dakota was only a straight line on the AAA triptych on the way between Chicago and Bozeman. We were from the Northeast, where you couldn't drive a tank full of gas without passing a dozen diners, shopping plazas, or town centers, no matter what direction you chose. The moon rises, huge, pregnant, in a sky cleared of clouds. Its reflection is so bright, Neil turns off the headlights, and we drive in this impossible daylight for hours.
Oh, that's beautiful. The true place. Anybody else have anything they'd like to say?
Pine forest, sun filtering through in layers, warm air, walking in the pine needles, on the pine needles, feeling the air and the sun on my face, quietly walking on the pine needles, thinking of my mother, how I loved her cooking blackberry cobbler in the little white enamel pan with the red rim. She said when we could pick the pan half full of berries, she would make a cobbler. Remembering her olive Indian face and her gray eyes.
Well, I'm working on a book that I can't find the title for, but I kind of like this full moon on snow. And I was thinking about bit of the book where this fits. I felt that my feelings for him were ancient, had been born thousands of years before, that I had expressed them back then by carving petroglyphs into subtle rock.
Ooh, nice. These are very true places, don't you think?
This kind of came, I had a conversation with my grandma today, and she said something that like has stuck with me all day long. So it's kind of processing through that. But she tends to be rather dreary at times. The things she knew about disasters, the things she'd learned from Webster's, was that there were no stars, no guiding lights. They're disorienting disasters. She shifted her 300-pound, 81-year-old frame in its leather chair and tried one last time to get into his headspace. She'd brought in sawdust from the woodshed when the lemonade pitcher had shattered. More efficient ways to sop it up existed in her domestic mind, but the sawdust, the cedar sawdust, also smelled of him. And she let it soak, a pile of tree tears collecting on the cabin floor. She walked around the place then, carrying the brass desk lamp and its favorite extension cord, touching all that was his, hoping for some haptic component to trigger some forgotten invocational spell and summon Jerry back from death for a kiss or an apology. Laying on a bed to rot was not living. She wanted to die with him. Why couldn't she? She carried the light outside, where the firs had lost their green to the weight of snow, and the full moon upon it, the howling in her heart of a love lost supposedly better than having never loved Jerry at all.
Okay, I think we're running out of time, but I want to end with a quote that is not mine. This is from Alice Munro, Lives of Girls and Women. And this, to me, is about True Place. What I wanted was every last thing, every layer of speech and of thought, stroke of light on bark or wall, every smell, pothole, pain, crack, delusion, held still and held together, radiant, everlasting. Thank you so much.
Present you with a little something from us. So when you have thoughts or moments or inspiration, you'll continue thinking of us at the Gables.
Of course. Thank you so much.
And if you have any questions for Brunonia, she'll be over in the museum store. I think Kara's going to take her over.
People, a few minutes to ask questions.
That would be fine here.
Okay.
Before we head
Yeah, you
over?
wanna do
Sure.
that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do that,
We'll head
absolutely.
over.
That would be great,
A
'cause-
few minutes for that. And
Okay.
then, yeah.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, questions? Now that would be embarrassing.
Yeah.
Come on, someone's gonna have a question.
Steve, what has inspired the True Place for your next book? Can we talk about that?
Oh, this one has inside information. Well, and it's set in Salem once again, and in Pride's Crossing this time. I usually do Salem and one other town, so last, in the map of True Places, it was Salem and Marblehead, which is where I grew up. This time it's Pride's Crossing where my grandmother lived. And the image system, as I said, is trees. The name of the book is The Fifth Petal, and there's another image in the book which is of a 5-petaled rose. Let's see. Well, it's the one thing I will say, because otherwise I'll be talking for an hour, but is that if you have read The Lace Reader and The Map of True Places, the characters in there come together in this third book. So you'll see them again. It's not the main part of the story, but they're all over this book. And I think I can't seem to lose those characters, so they keep coming back to me. So if you keep reading me, you're going to keep meeting them. Thanks.
Is there any particular time of day you like to write?
3 a.m. I don't sleep sleep as well as I used to. So 3 a.m. is a quiet, good time to start. And then I usually write for a few hours, then go back to bed, then not go anywhere until after 10. But then I write most of the day. So, I get it in the afternoon. And one thing is, I said I was caffeine-less. I'm not. I drink Diet Coke. But I don't drink it in the morning, only in the afternoon. Because editing takes caffeine. And regular creation takes a lack of it for me. I need to be almost dreamy to create. So thanks. Good question. Yes.
You had a small flaw in your first comment about your main character.
Yes.
We're not allowed to climb in a friendship unless we're in harness.
Unless you're, yes, that's right. And I find out some things later. But, this is fiction. So, and I think I said that in the back of the book, things that if I didn't, I should have. Thank you. Yeah, you have to be in harness. Yeah. To my fiction writer's eyes, no harness. And then I was told you're not allowed to, but sometimes it happens. And I don't know, I won't say who told me that. So, because I don't want to get anyone in trouble. But it certainly inspired a character. And I did have him in harness. So don't worry. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Did you feel in some way like you needed to write the map of true places in order to feel that you had found your true place by any chance?
Yeah, it was interesting because I was, as I said, I'd lost both my mom and dad at that time, and we moved back here. And, Salem, well, I grew up in Marblehead, but we were on the Salem Harbor side, and I spent quite a bit of time in Salem, and it had changed so much from, the early 70s when I left. First of all, we didn't have quite the number of tourists we have now, and things were different. I mean, there were some things that are much better, and but it was just different. And so I was trying to figure out where it was I belonged, and in terms of place, it was definitely Salem. We used to say, because we lived in Los Angeles before this, where do you go after LA that's just as strange and weird and wonderful? And Salem's the answer to that. So, and open to anything, so. But I was searching for a true place. And I think it's here, honestly. It's what we hold in our hearts. So whatever parts of that I was looking for, I found in that book. So thank you for asking that.
Do you have any affiliation to psychiatry?
I have a lot of friends who are psychiatrists or psychologists, and my niece was studying to be a psychotherapist while I was writing the book. And I got to try out all of the case work, and part of this book is about ethics, honestly. And they were in the middle of an ethics class, so I got to ask her class the ethical questions I wanted to ask, and I had, there were all different answers to that. But yes, and I have a lot of friends who are in the profession and vetted things very carefully for me. So thank you. And I think it's what I wanted to be if I were a writer. Yeah. So I always write something that has a psychological edge to it. So. Anyone else? Yes.
Don't you think you have to be into the psychology of life to write?
To write? Well, I would hope so. I think you have to have some intuitive grasp on that, whether or not you've studied. But I do think it helps to understand characters, certainly. And as I said, I do a little bit of method writing, so I try to embody my characters to a certain extent, which was great fun during the Lace Reader because no one knew me in Salem. So I could walk around as a character. Not so easy anymore. It just looks like you're very strange.
So I have a wonderful song that you might want to look up because your book reminds me of it. It's called Half Acre by a group called HEM, H-E-M. And it's a story of a woman who tore a piece of a map from a half acre of Michigan. And it's about holding on to that place and feeling rooted and rootless by it. And every time I hear it, it brings me to tears. But I think it would resonate with you.
Thank you so much. I just put it on the phone. Thanks. Anybody else? Okay.
So I think we'll...
Thank you. to the Right Around the Box people.
Okay,
Second row.
Wow.
They had their big conference here, I have to give you a plug.
Yeah,
It's
the
a
writing is beautiful.
international plug. And we were here last year for the first unconference of the Writer on the Box, who want to come back next year. So we need to talk. Karen isn't here tonight, so I'm.
Yeah. Thank you. Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank
So,
you.
and our